Thank you. Thank you for coming out on Morgan Wallen night. I didn't know who he was either, but he's the guy who's screwing up traffic. He's the massive country star who's singing at the
right at the stadium. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So,
and thanks to Boswell for having us. Independent bookstores are really important to writers because this is where starter writers really find their footing. This is the recommendations from booksellers. They put a book in your hand, and that doesn't happen when you buy a book online. That's why it's really important to be supporting your local independent bookstore. So thanks so much to Boswell Books for having us. So we're going to talk about The Guilty One and a bit about writing, but we'll open it up to audience questions at the end. That's always kind of my favorite part, so to see what other people want to know. But so let's dive into The Guilty One. So your hero, Cal Farrell, in a lot of thrillers, characters are often fairly one-dimensional, chiseled features and bulging muscles and not a lot of discernible humanity. Cal Farrell, on the other hand, is a very human character. He goes through a pretty terrible and traumatic experience at the beginning of this book, and we see the real consequences for him of that experience. So why this kind of hero?
That's a great question, and throughout the night, I'm probably going to regurgitate wisdom that I have learned from you. So I'm just gonna. A lot of people know Nick has a great series with the Peter Ash series, and he's been an incredible mentor. He's been an oracle to all of us. But that is, and it was probably you who said, I'm going to give you credit,
all right,
to do, to find your genre and do the same thing but different, just a little bit different. And, with crime thrillers, with detective stories, usually you will have sort of a haunted detective,
jazz-loving alcoholic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to shy away from that. I wanted him to be haunted. I wanted him to go through things, but I wanted him to be sort of proactive. I didn't want him to disappear, into a bottle or with a needle. I wanted him to actually realize, I've got a problem. I went through this traumatic experience, but I want to be proactive, and I want to try and narrow the gap between who I am now and my best self. I want him to be proactive. Of course, his problems, he can't outrun them. He tries, but I wanted him to be proactive. I wanted him to be sort of optimistic in that regard and to do all that he could to sort of solve his own problems.
He's also very funny, which is one of the things I like about this book, is the patented Schweigart humor kind of comes through in little bits and pieces.
Well, I couldn't do bulging muscles and, the rugged good looks, but I can't, that's just it's a defense mechanism for me. It's a defense mechanism for my character. Like I said, he's very proactive. When we meet him in the book, he is working with the police psychologist to recover some memories that he can't pierce the veil of what had happened to him that day. And you get a sense that, he resorts to humor. And I think one of the lines, the psychologist is, do you always use humor as a shield? And he's like, well, when questions feel like swords, yes. So
when so I read a lot of genre fiction. And the thing that one of the things I loved about this book is Cal's emotional life is very specific. This is not generalized anxiety. It comes from a very specific event, and you really navigate him through this. And to me, that's one of the things that makes this book unlike anything I've really seen before. And so, where did that specificity come from?
Well, a lot of research, obviously, but it's, it manifests a lot when and this is something that I have had before, like I'll get an eye twitch every now and again if I get over caffeinated. And so I'm like, what, that'll be a good thing. If he senses trouble's coming, he'll sometimes get a little eye twitch, but he'll have lost time. He'll have trouble sleeping. He will get depressed. I wasn't going to use claustrophobia because you took that. Damn it. yeah, the white static was already taken, so I couldn't do that. But he has a lot of different symptoms, and his psychologist like is almost gleeful when he presents a new symptom. She's like, all right, we're going to check the box. And he's like, you seem awfully happy about this. You know, am I that predictable? She's like, yes, but you're wonderfully predictable. So he's trying to.
He's a textbook case.
He's a textbook case. And he's like, oh, I'm such a cliche. And she's like, no, this is great. This is great. We're moving through it. We're moving through it.
Well, this book is also notably different from your other work. So where did the urge to write about this kind of subject matter, right? A police novel, and I'm not giving anything away because it's on the jacket flap, but a serial killer. So you know, how did you end up with this subject matter?
I can't really figure out what I want to be when I grow up yet. So I've written horror, I've written romance, but crime allows you to tell so many different stories. And you can tell horror and crime, you can have romance and crime. So this genre to me encompasses all the things that I kind of want to explore. And if you have a main character, a detective character, you can talk about all sorts of societal issues, and it's just a good mechanism to explore things that you want to explore. So that's kind of why I chose that. I'd always wanted to tell my take on a serial killer story. So that's kind of where that came from.
Well, and so this is a really fast book. You know, it's a fast read. There's lots of twists and turns, but it has a lot more, to me, a lot more sort of thematic richness. I mean, you're really leaning into your subject matter, right? This is nuanced and it's a complex view of police and policing. So that psychology of that work, the emotional hazards that accumulate over the years, I think other writers sort of gesture at that. You know, we have Michael Connelly, you know, Harry Bosch doesn't want to show the crime scene pictures to his daughter, but you know, you're really leaning into that. So talk about that a little bit. Why was that so important?
So I'm not a first responder. I'm not a police officer. I like to joke that the only weapon I have at work is PowerPoint. Like, I am not at all a first responder, but for the day job, I work for the federal government, and we, in our portfolio, we had to deal with active shooters. We would have to, you know, sort of educate businesses and infrastructure on what to do in the event of an active shooter. So I kind of had to live that for, you know, several years. And as you can imagine, it's extremely depressing. These events are not going away. They seem to only be getting more frequent and worse. So I was very familiar with what happens in those events and what happens after those events and what happens to the people and the responders after those events. And I went to a talk by, forget what it was, in Bethesda, Maryland. It was the Discovery Channel headquarters had an active shooter event, and they had the responders who responded that day, and they had a police officer there who was the person who put down the shooter. And just hearing his story firsthand, I kind of was able to, obviously not experience that, but I've just through work, through interactions, through conversations, through talks that I've been to, I've learned a lot about that subject matter. So that's kind of why the book opens with that. That's kind of why Cal has to deal with that. But hopefully that's where some of the authenticity comes from. So
was that sort of the generating impulse for this book, was sort of that going to that event?
It was twofold. I had, you know, sometimes you don't know where ideas come from, and sometimes it's a little bit of chocolate and a little bit of peanut butter, and it kind of comes together. I've always wanted to tell this serial killer story. And then I had the idea for the active shooter bit as well. I promise it's not all depressing, everybody. It's dark, but there is some humor in it. But when we meet the main character, all he wants to do is be a detective. That is his reason for being. That's his best self. That's what he wants to be. When he starts out, he's a patrol officer, and he is responding to a drunken, disorderly call. A very large man is sort of menacing a convenience store, and he gets one cuff on the guy, and the guy freaks out, and he starts swinging him around like Thor's hammer. And he's like, what the hell am I doing here? And no sooner does he get does he get the suspect in his unit? Then he gets the call that he's blocks away from an active shooter pen, and he is the first one on scene to have to respond. He goes into the office building, and he's passing the injured, and he wants to stop, but his training is telling him, go, go, go. You have to go. You have to go straight at it. So he manages to corner the shooter in a conference room. He's getting ready to wheel in. He's sweaty. He's charged up. He wheels into the conference room, and then he doesn't remember anything. He wakes up in the back of an ambulance.
Covered with blood.
Covered with blood. He's told that he's a hero, but his bosses won't quite meet his eye. And 6 months later, that's where the story picks up. He was rapidly promoted to detective, but he is sort of struggling with the imposter syndrome of that. His fellow officers and fellow detectives kind of whisper Killer Callum behind his back. He doesn't really have any friends, and he's trying to figure out what happened. And he's working with the psychologist to sort of pierce the veil on that day. And to sort of get himself back on track, he starts running again, and he's running along the trail one morning, and he spies a body 70 feet high in a tree, impossibly high. And that is the first that Alexandria realizes it has a serial killer on its hands. So Cal sort of takes it upon himself to, pursue the serial killer, identify the serial killer, sort of clear his name and
prove himself.
And prove himself, absolutely, to sort of quiet that imposter syndrome down. But the only thing a town likes more than building a hero up is to tear one down. So if he doesn't find out who the killer is, there are many in the department who would be totally happy to make him the guilty one.
I was interested that you don't, and I think a lot of writers would have done this just because for dramatic reasons, would have given us the shooter's point of view in that initial set of scenes. So why did you decide not to? You don't want to glorify it?
No, I don't want to glorify it, but I do have a brief chapter where I do go into it.
Right, but you're in his head.
You're in his head, but just for the purposes of the first act, he's the centaur at the center of the maze, and
he's the monster.
He's the monster, and Cal is running towards the monster, and it has more dramatic impact, I think, if you don't know. But you do dip into his head for a little bit for plot reasons.
Right. So you wrote this great piece for Crime Reads, because we were just talking about this, which is sort of the history of serial killers, and you did those details are woven into the book as well. So did that tell us a little bit about that history, because I think it's super interesting. Did you go in search of that? Is that something that was just part of your lexicon already because you're thinking about serial killers?
Well, I don't spend all of my time thinking about serial killers.
I
would just like to point that out. But yeah, my wife is like, thank God. Although we will go out to date night in Old Town Alexandria, and we'll be passing an alley or something, and I'll be like, that's a great place to drop a body. And my wife is like, you're so romantic. But what fascinated me about in that article was not just the serial killers, but the mass hysteria that surrounds a serial killer. And one of the famous ones before Jack the Ripper, who was the 800-pound gorilla, 50 years beforehand, there was a criminal in London called Spring-Heeled Jack, and he would make sort of incredible leaps, and the London newspapers at the time would write, would have woodcuts of him being like this demonic figure with glowing eyes, and
he would leap in front of a carriage and it would overturn, and it was really
it's insane.
Yeah,
and people would believe it. And 50 years before that, there was somebody called the London Monster who would go around and poke people with needles, and when pickpockets would get rolled up by the cops, they'd just point and say, the London Monster, and everybody go, what, huh? And they would run away. So just how mass hysteria fuels these things. And the same thing happened with Son of Sam, the same thing happened with Zodiac, obviously Jack the Ripper, but that always just sort of fascinated me. And I had always wanted to tell that story, because Old Town Alexandria is such a neat spot. It looks like, it could be London. It's very colonial, great old houses. It's a port city. You think of Washington, D.C. This is in the shadow of Washington, D.C. This is a nice little gem. It's its own community, but you could sort of feel yourself tumbling down the centuries when you walk down certain cobblestone streets and gaslit old colonial homes. And I'm like, it's just a great spooky spot to have its own. It deserved its own fictional serial killer.
And you're just
and I was just the man to give it to it.
So what was the first book that you can remember that really hit you, that you read it and you said, I want to do this?
It may have been Stephen King's It, which is kind of crazy. I remember watching like the crappy adaptation on ABC, and I'm terrified of clowns. Like, I don't know. Clowns, sharks, and ventriloquist dummies. Those are my, like, that's it. I will have nightmares and zombies. I will have nightmares every now and again, and Kate will be like, there's no clowns in the house. You're okay.
I had to walk out of a zombie movie, and then for months afterward, I would wake up in the middle of the night and have to hang on to Margaret. Scary dreams, scary dreams.
Can't do it.
I can't do zombies.
But something about that fascinated me, and I went back and I read the book, and I don't know if that set the hook, but that was something where I was like, I have to go back. I have to read the book. I absorbed the book, and then I just kept following Stephen King, and my first couple of novels were horror or urban fantasy.
Right.
So, that's probably the answer.
So then, when did you start to write then?
At the Coast Guard Academy, which is a hotbed of creativity, the military. I think. Yeah, I had.
It's your way of coping in a challenging circumstance.
I think so, or I was just lazy, because we had in junior year, I was in an English lit class, and we had the opportunity to do our spring project, and it was either write a term paper, which would require going to the library and researching and footnoting, or you could write a story. And I'm like, I will write a story because I am inherently lazy. And I won $100 in a writing contest, and that was 1994.
That's real money back then.
And I was a cadet, and we didn't have any money. So, and then I won $250 the next year in the writing competition, and I didn't make another dime from writing in 20 years. But the Coast Guard Academy, that's where I started to write. And when you are in that. And we were only allowed to have one shelf of personal effects in our room. We all had to dress the same. We all had to act the same. We all had to march together in formation. There was no creativity or individuality. So I think by that time I was kind of ready to pop.
That makes sense. I've never thought of you as an institutional person.
You could say I should be institutionalized. But yeah, I would. I tried really hard. But I'm a wise ass, and they don't like that in the military. They're not fond of that in the Coast Guard. I had to do a lot of push-ups, a lot of demerits, but that's where it started. So it's the Coast Guard's fault.
Well, you're also a big comic book fan.
This is true.
You're a notorious nerd in that regard, which I appreciate. But the form has changed a lot since I was a kid. But I don't think of comic books of that era, which. I think they were relatively the same when you were a kid, when I was a kid, as being, again, super nuanced, character driven.
Oh, Nick, I will give you a reading list. We're gonna go immediately to a comic book store after we buy all the books in here.
But so how do you get from what do you take from that to write a book like this? Like, what are the lessons you learned as a reader and a writer from comic books?
So I do have a good answer for this, I think.
As opposed to the rest of your answers, which really didn't.
I thought about this. If you think of most like detective fiction, if you think of, our crime-fighting heroes, the jazz-loving tortured detectives, they are all sort of in the Batman archetype. They are all out for vengeance. They are out for justice. They are dark avengers of the night.
I wear black on the outside because black is how I feel on the inside.
Yes.
Yeah.
My parents were killed, and I must avenge them. I purposely wanted Cal to be more of a Superman archetype. I don't want to say he's a Ted Lasso of detectives, but I wanted him to be optimistic. I wanted him to have empathy. I wanted him to be, if you or somebody in your family were in trouble and this detective was dispatched to work on your case, this is somebody that you would want to answer on the other end of 911. I wanted this detective to be sort of full of empathy, almost to a fault. So he is more of a Superman archetype than a Batman archetype.
That sounds almost scholarly, Bill.
I see. I tell you.
Well, there are a number of comic book references in this book. You just mentioned the Thor's hammer, which is like page 2, maybe, or page 1.
Yeah, well, and I stole that from my father, who was he was a police officer for a few years, and he was probably 100 pounds soaking wet, and he got a cuff on a guy, and this guy swung him around over his head, and that always lodged in my head. So I had to steal that one from my dad.
Well, we do steal from life,
of
right?
course.
I mean, that's the thing. So every writer needs to sort of figure out their process. If you take a writing class, they often talk about sort of the writer's voice, but I think that the process is really more important, to find that way of working that lets you keep telling the story, right? Moving it forward. I know one writer who gets up at the same time every day, has the exact same breakfast, walks the exact same route to his office, and arrives at the exact same time every day. And it's an important part of his ritual, right? To get to work. I know another writer who writes an entire book on her phone, which seems to me to be crazy, but she does it. So you have a fairly demanding day job. How do you've written 7 books. How do you do that in the context of working for the man?
Trial and error, and not on my phone. But you kind of back your way into your process. It's hilarious. When I was a single guy, I thought I was so busy, and I would only write on Sundays, and I would write all day. And every Saturday night, I'd be like, where was I in the story? What was I trying to accomplish? What's going on? And it was like, I had all the time in the world. I didn't realize it. And then I got married, and I had a daughter, and I've got a demanding day job. And I'm like looking back at the oceans of time that I had.
Yeah.
But you have to get really ruthless with your time. So I would have maybe 30 minutes. So I would wake up at dark 30, cup of coffee, feed the cats, walk downstairs, and I have a very modest word count. For any prospective writers out there, it's 250 words a day. That's my process. I can't write any less. Sometimes 249 is a stretch, and I just have to throw an extra "the" in there. And sometimes you're in a groove. It's 600 words a day. But like 30 minutes or something. But if I sit down at the same time every day and I write, and again, modest word count, removing that pressure, you've got that story running like a background program in your head all the time. And you're walking the dog, you're breaking story.
Yeah.
I'm in the shower, I got to jump out, and I got to, put my phone, use this word instead of this word. But that's what works for me. And some folks like to write at night. Some people have that discipline where they can write once a week. I do not have that discipline.
Yeah, I don't understand how that works either, because for me, I sort of have to touch it every day.
Yeah, it's not. It sounds weird because it sounds like, oh, you write every day, you have discipline. No, I have limited willpower, but I have, I get into the zone where that if I don't do it, I feel guilty, and I'm using my limited willpower wisely.
Yeah.
I think so. I don't give myself an out. I do that every day, and then at the end of a year, you've got a first draft for a novel. When I was writing once a week, that novel took 4 years. So
yeah, 250 words is about a finished page. So if you write a page a day, you can write a book a year.
Works for me.
Yeah. So one of the other things I really admire about you as a writer is how different your projects are from each other, right? There's your Coast Guard book. There's this horror trilogy, which I really enjoy, by the way. A romance set in the music industry, and this, what to me I think is a really ambitious police thriller. So I write a series, and so I always know when it's time to start the next book. I always kind of know who the main characters are. I know the kind of world it's going to be in, and there's some variation within all of that. But it sort of amazes me that with your writing career, you have so many more options to choose from. So how do you how do you narrow down what the next project is going to be? Or is it just whatever has shown up in your head, or do you have sort of a laundry list of things you want to try?
Well, I want to be Nick Petrie when I grow up. I don't want all that choice. I want my character, and I want to tell stories in that world with that character. And I sometimes with the horror story, that just sort of came to me. I was trying to write an important literary novel, and I was working on it really hard for a couple of months. And then I had a story about a shapeshifter in my neighborhood that was eating cats and dogs. And I would sit down. I would be like, Bill, you really have to knuckle down and tell this important literary story. And my wife was like, well, why don't you actually write what is, making you happy? Why are you going out of your way to ignore what is taking up real estate in your head? So I wrote that story. And then halfway through that story, the character spoke to me, and there was another story, and then halfway through that book, I got the idea for a third one. And then when that wrapped up, I kind of waffled a bit trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. But Cal for me was an interesting character that I could see coming back to, that I had a lot of affection for, who was imperfect, but again, trying to be his best self. And that was a compelling theme to me, that he was actively trying to be a better person instead of retreating into a bottle like we mentioned. And just, again, with crime, you can tell any kind of story that you want. So I think in this one, I definitely drew from some of the horror elements that I had written in the past. I mean, the serial killer is spooky.
Yeah,
I would like to think.
For sure.
There's romance for anybody that likes that. I've got some romance in there as well. But it's just, you can kind of touch all the bases.
Right. Well, you've also done some work with James Patterson, and I know a number of folks who have written with him. And my understanding is that it's a sort of a challenging process. So I don't want you to tell tales out of school. Please remember that this is being recorded and will be on the internet for all time. So do keep that in mind. But so tell us a little bit about what that process was like, and kind of what you learned from it.
So James, really up and coming young author. I think is showing a lot of promise.
He might be big someday.
I think he's gonna go the distance. It was interesting, and success is not always in a straight line. And I like to tell the story. So I had written a book that didn't go. I had submitted it, and an editor at this publisher really liked it and really championed it. But, in the room, she got outvoted, and it didn't go. And she ended up leaving that publisher, and she went to go work for James Patterson. So she was having lunch with our agent, and she had mentioned, he's looking for, potential new collaborators. And my agent mentioned my name. She's like, I remember Bill. I love that book. And I sort of had the opportunity from that to audition for James Patterson. So, and it was all very secretive, all very, contracts and all that. But basically,
you couldn't tell anybody.
Right. So, it was all very hush hush. And basically, I had a one-line teaser, and I had to sort of agree that, I wasn't going to reveal any of this stuff. But I then got to come up with a story outline, and we would go back and forth for a process of about 7 weeks. And he is the hardest working writer out there. The guy lives, eats, breathes story. I read a profile on him in Vanity Fair where he works out of a big giant 4-poster bed.
I remember that, yeah.
He's got just piles of manuscripts all around him. And he has so many projects that, he can't possibly write them all himself. So that's why he needs guys like me to help, because he is bursting with story. He's an old advertising guy. So he is all about the hook, and he knows what sells, and he's constantly got stories moving. So I would write some pages, and I think, all right, I I bought myself some time. I'm going to submit them in the morning, and I'll have a couple of days off. I'll relax, and ping in my inbox by that day, I would have, you need to change this, you need to change this. I mean, it was probably, I know it was a 120-page story or 130-page story. It was the fastest 4 or 5 months, but he's so precise. He knows what he wants. His stories are tight as a drum. You know, I think you could tell, like with Cal, a lot of feelings, some interior stuff. He's all about keeping that plot moving.
Right.
There are no scenes of James Patterson characters sitting in a diner talking about their feelings.
Well, no, although to be fair, in crime novels, there's not much of that for the rest of us either.
That's true.
But so he's really functioning as kind of a high-level editor in a way, right? He's not generating story, but he's massaging what you come up with to say, this is, do more of this and do less of this, or this is all wrong, do something else.
He knows where the story's going. He knows what he wants. He knows the tent poles, and I am.
Oh, really? It's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
He gives plenty of breadcrumbs to follow the story, and if you are to the left or to the right, he can get you right back on track.
Interesting.
But it was a fascinating process. I learned more in those 4 or 5 months working with him, and the organization and the efficiency than I probably learned in the previous 10 years, trying to stumble around in the dark on my own.
Yeah, I've heard similar stuff from other writers who work with him, that it is just just the laser-like focus is
you introduced me to Brendan,
yeah.
which was super helpful.
Same thing.
Yeah, when I was in the auditioning process, Nick introduced me to a couple of his co-writers who, you know, I'm like, I don't know if I could do this, and they're like, stick with it, young man. You can do this. So and I did. So I was grateful. But you know, those first couple of weeks, I was like, there's no way. I can't. I was like hanging on for dear life. But it was fun.
Well, Brendan's latest collaboration with Patterson, the premise was the president goes crazy. I don't know where he got that idea, where that came from, but
James, man, big crazy
yeah,
ideas.
Well, so do we have any questions out there? Any other? Oh, right there.
Did you do any consulting with either serial killer investigators or those who suspect them? Would you tell us about that?
I did not. I wish, but I love all of those. I've read all of those sort of profiling books, and you know, the guys who actually go in and interview serial killers. That's just reading those books secondhand is scary enough for me. There's no chance that I would get into a cell with somebody. And no, I don't know any of those profilers, but oh man, if I could meet one.
Yeah, if you know some.
If you're out there. And also, Jim, I'd love to work with you again.
Because he's totally watching this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he's taking notes.
He's in his 4-poster bed, and he's got this on in the background.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Yep.
So we've got a friend, Don Bentley. I read military thrillers from him. They're fantastic, and it's not a world that I had been introduced to until I met Don, and they're fantastic books. Books that I can't wait to. Oh yeah, yes, Orphan X. Thank you, Greg Hurwitz. I want to also be Greg Hurwitz when I grow up, and it was he writes the Orphan X series, and because I'm a comic book guy, like to me, Orphan X is almost like Batman without the cape.
Oh, totally.
Totally.
Yeah. Fortress of Solitude, he's got the whole Batcave thing.
And he's written Batman.
Right.
And he's written Moon Knight, and he's written The Punisher. And it was funny, he was at the last Thriller Fest, and I was talking with Tim Hendricks, who just had his book released,
right.
The Instructor, awesome book. And I was talking to him, I was like, look, Tim, if I'm talking to you and I suddenly break away, it's because Greg Hurwitz walks by. And sure enough, he walked by. I was like, Tim, out of my way. And I was like Chris Farley in Saturday Night. I was like, hey, Greg Hurwitz, remember when you wrote that?
That thing?
That was awesome. Yeah, I'm, you know, you've introduced me to Philly Child, and I've met some other pretty big authors. But when you really get to meet somebody that you just love their work, and it may not be the most popular person ever, but yeah, I fanboyed all over that guy. He's probably, next time he sees me, he's gonna be like, yeesh. But yeah, that was, and another, I love Swedish crime fiction for whatever reason. I love the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo books. I love the Kurt Wallander books. I want to go to Sweden. My wife's like, because you read a lot of murders there? That doesn't make any sense, but kind of.
How did we meet?
Oh, boy. Was that night I saved your life?
Right. Right.
At a
Yes, I was being threatened by a drunken hooker, and Bill stepped in.
No, we met 2016 at there's Thriller Fest. It's this great conference, and we have the same agent, and we met at a cocktail party, and I just like the cut of your jib, sir.
And you were an immediate wise ass, which I really appreciate.
Yes,
yeah.
we bonded immediately on that, and our agent was like, "You guys are going to be friends," and we're like, "Yes, ma'am." And it's been a bromance ever since.
Yeah, Bill was one of the first real friends I made in the writing world. It's a really welcoming community, but it's also such a weird, solitary thing to do for a living that it's really important to have people to, who share your disease, right? Who you can have that conversation with. So I don't know. We talk on a fairly regular basis, which I appreciate.
We do, and it's funny because whenever our families are together, like Kate and Margaret will be like, "All right, enough writing talk. Come out of the corner, boys."
Talk about other things.
So yeah, we've been 2016.
Yeah. And I'm trying to think about what else to say about that, but that's about it.
Everything else is classified.
Yeah, right. Any other questions? Oh.
I love John. Talk about one, can't wait to read the next book. I find that the very first sentence, first page of that book. And what do you think of that?
You interviewed him.
I did for this bookstore. He didn't used to do book tours. He used to only go to 5 bookstores, and they were the bookstores that would have him for his first book, which was not a big success. That was A Time to Kill. And then The Firm was his second book and was a gigantic monster worldwide hit. But he, for many, many years after that, would never go to other bookstores that wanted him because he, I don't know if he's holding a grudge or if he's being loyal, but that was kind of his mode. But a couple of books back, I think he sort of saw the light in the independent bookstore world and realized how many of these stores had really been supporting him. And so I got to, it wasn't like this, right? So this was during the pandemic. And he had 3 of these in a row, and I was the middle guy, right? So he was very much on message. He was doing his thing. And I was asking sort of some touchy-feely questions, and he was not at all interested in talking about his writing process or any of this other sort of stuff. But he is a really interesting writer because he's these legal thrillers. He is really taking a legal issue that he's interested in, and he's really examining it from all sides. And he is walking this, very sort of interesting line because there are, he's in this sort of polarized world that we have, right? There are people who really write from the right or write from the left, and he is really straight down the middle. But he's examining issues of ethics and morality, and I think that really speaks to people. Sure, there was not a lot of personal interaction, but he was perfectly pleasant. He had good answers to my not so good questions,
And you had 1 hour on a screen with him.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the reasons why I like to do this is because it's an excuse to either meet somebody new or to hang out with somebody I've known before. And if I can get somebody to come to Milwaukee, then that's good for this bookstore, which I'm so very fond of. And it's a chance to, hang out and talk to other writers. And you know, it's just not the same on a screen. It is just, you don't get the beer afterward or the meal before or whatever. But this is one of my favorite things to do. Any other question?
Didn't you have a question from your students? You'll save it for later. Also classified? I got you.
Oh. Thank you for that. We appreciate that. Just for the video audience, we just want to say that the questioner has said that she will buy a book today. So that's what the bookstore is in business of doing. So just want to make that clear. Thank you.
So yeah,
Recap the question, would you?
Sure. Yes. It's sort of general feelings about the police, because in a lot of areas they're not regarded too highly, and other areas they are, and it's sort of a fraught time. And I am always have terrible timing. So I was probably 6 months into writing this when the George Floyd murder took place. And again, I was conflicted because, again, my father was a police officer for a while. I know many police officers. I do believe that the vast majority of police officers are doing the very best they can to keep everybody safe. And when you dial 911, you want somebody to pick up and to come to you. But sadly, a lot of people who dial 911 end up being victimized themselves. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to have a detective that I wanted to create what I want to see in the world, basically. Yeah. I wanted to create a detective that is full of empathy. Like I said, if you call this person, they're going to show up, they are going to help you. It is this guy, my character, Cal, he is not a hard ass. He wants to solve puzzles. He wants to help people. So that is how I square that circle in myself, and hopefully detectives will actually like it, and it can, if you see it, you can be it.
Right. Well, it's such an interesting phenomenon, right? It's a really hard job to be a cop. It's physically demanding. It's mentally and emotionally challenging, and the work accumulates in your psyche. I know a few cops, and I've had a bunch of clients in my previous life who were cops, and it gets harder to you see the world through a certain lens, and it's not a super positive lens. There's a longstanding feud in general between firefighters and cops, because firefighters get to be the hero. They have the calendars, and they show up when your house is on fire or somebody's not feeling well. The paramedics come, and the cops always show up on your worst day, right? So it's they are never, but they're motivated. Again, not all of them, but the ones that I know are motivated because they want to help people, and they want to be that stabilizing force in the world. So it's a hard thing, and it's a challenging topic. All right, other thoughts?
But I want to ask if that's factored in the book, or if you see that coming up, or if you are writing to a state.
Bingo. Yes. So I work for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA.
Which, by the way, sounds great.
It's
super cool.
It's super.
Yeah.
Again, my biggest weapon is PowerPoint. So it's great mission, great people, but it is like any day job. So if the meetings get too boring, I kind of go back in my head and I'm breaking story, and so it is definitely to escape. There are occasionally with plot points and such, like with threats or what have you. Like, again, active shooter was a huge thing in my portfolio years ago. and that obviously wove its way into my fiction. But yeah, I don't think I'm going to put a lot of government bureaucracy in there, but hopefully it does inform, living in the shadow of DC. It does sort of sometimes color the world, because it is such a big factor out where I live.
But I could see your character Cal getting, sort of coming into conflict with something. So he thinks it's a normal murder that he's got to investigate, and there turns out to be a national security piece of that. I could see that, but maybe you're not interested in writing that.
You're spoiling it.
Oh shit!
Don't record that. No.
All right. Any other questions? We're about out of time, so speak now or forever hold your peace.
Peter Ash. Come on. Peter Ash would just destroy Cal with all of his books. He's got 7 books worth of experience. Cal's got 1. I would like to think they would go out for a beer together.
Yes. I think they would get along.
Yes, and I am not pandering because the interview's over, but I read Peter Ash the day it comes out.
Oh, that's very nice of you. I appreciate that.
Of course. And so should all of you if you don't already.
I didn't pay him for that at all. Yeah. Well, and so we do have to mention the other really important thing about being a writer, that it's important to marry well. And we have both done that. Our sweethearts are right up here. So.
Thank you for putting up with us.
Yes. It's not easy.
Our psychop writer. Yeah.
All right, come on. Last chance.
Let them. like we're in control. No, of course. Like I had a couple of books that didn't quite get over the finish line, and with The Guilty One, I had 2 beta readers, my wife and my Nick, and I told them both, like, you can't be nice. You gotta let me have it. And Kate, prior to doing that, had been very nice, and this is misspelled wrong and change this. When I told her, I was like, the gloves got to come off. She's like, all right, you got to do this. You got to do this. And I was like, body shot. Oh my God.
It hurts.
It hurts. And what hurt worse is that she was so right.
I know. That's always problematic.
And then we went on a long walk for like 90 minutes, and I'm like, but. And she's like, no. By the end, I was like, God damn it. Right. So yes, no.
Yeah, there's usually a point with me where I'm about a third of the way into something, and I'm like, I can't tell if this is any good or not. I just can't see it. And so that's usually when I show it to Margaret. But then I get so deep into it that, like, I don't want anybody to say anything about it.
Oh, I am too fragile to show anybody anything a third of the way into it.
I just am ready to throw it away at that point. And Margaret, I don't know if this is true or not, but she always just says, "Oh, it's great. Just keep going." No, you don't. No. Well, and this is why people have asked me sort of why I'm so interested in character, right? And why I'm so interested in, and maybe it's the same for you. It's because I want to write something that Margaret will want to read, right? So there has to be real characters, right? People that you want to root for. Yes. All right. Well, there aren't any more questions. All right.
Thank you so much for
Thanks
coming
for coming,
out.
folks.
We appreciate it. And thank you to Boswell Books.
Absolutely.